In early 1993, the world was shaken by the loss of its greatest and longest-standing superhero, as news of Superman's demise at the hands of the monstrous Doomsday reverberated across the globe. The death of Superman's story instantly became one of the most famous and iconic moments in all of comic book history. DC's last-ditch attempts to turn around the declining sales had turned out to be a huge success, but at what cost? The loss of their flagship character. But with the story now in the rearview mirror, the question became, what happens next? Superman was killed and DC had reaped the rewards of such a shocking event, but could they really continue on without the Man of Tomorrow? Superman was never supposed to stay dead. The plan from the very beginning was to eventually bring the character back, but it was going to be how they chose to do this that would prove to be the real make or break moment for the company at the time. So in this video I want to discuss the aftermath of the death of Superman's story, how it impacted DC Comics and the industry as a whole, and how the company's attempts to follow up this iconic story saw diminished returns and fundamental changes to the comic book landscape that would shake the industry to its very foundations, as DC set about bringing back the Man of Steel. The death of Superman, as seen in the climactic pages of Superman issue 75, was both a moment in time, one where the outside world stopped and acknowledged the loss of one of fiction's greatest heroes, and a monumental financial success for DC Comics. Mike Carlin, Dan Jurgens, Jerry Ordway, and the writers at DC had essentially, when backed into a corner, played the great ace up their sleeve, and it worked. Superman 75 became the highest selling comic book of the year, and almost single-handedly doubled DC's entire share of the comic book market. To call it a success would be an understatement, but inherently it came with a lot of questions. Firstly, what happens now? How does DC carry on their multiple Superman comic books that were all among the best-selling of the year? Could they really just cancel them all and let the Man of Steel rest in peace? The subsequent issues released after Superman 75, starting with Action Comics issue 685, began a story that was known as The Funeral for a Friend, a series of issues in which we see how Superman's death affects the existing Superman supporting cast and the wider DC universe. These issues truly aimed to touch on the heartstrings of its readership, and for the most part they did just that. One of the more impactful moments in the whole issue comes in the form of the character Bibbo Babowski, a former down-on-their-luck drunk turned bar owner who was a personal friend and admirer of Superman. For Bibbo, Superman was everything. He saved his life and gave him the confidence to become a better person. But in the morning, he sits in his empty bar in the dark, and he pleads out into the unknown, asking,
God, I gotta ask you. Why? Why should Superman die and a washed up old roughneck like me goes on living? It ain't right, God. It just ain't right.
This demonstrated the tremendous loss that the entire DC universe seemed to collectively feel. Superman was a hero to everyone. Every single person in the DC universe, respective of their different titles and series, seemed to have a story, a eulogy even, for the Man of Steel. And these issues allowed for those stories to be told. However, arguably the most emotional moment of all came in the Man of Steel issues 20 and 21, when Lois Lane finally reaches out to Jonathan and Martha Kent, and the three break down and share their collective loss over the phone. John and Martha, watching the funeral processions from Smallville, were heartbroken as they bury their son's possessions in the backyard, in the very crater where they discovered him all those years ago. This elderly couple represent the impact that Superman had on the everyman perfectly. He came into their life, literally fell out of the sky, and changed everything for them. He not only gave them a son, but a purpose. And that's when it happened. The strain of such a loss was too much to handle, and Jonathan suffers a heart attack. Rushed into a nearby hospital, his heart flatlines, and with that, all of DC's Superman titles went on an official hiatus. You see, following the Memorial issues, DC made the decision to cancel all of the 4 Superman comics for a 3-month period to allow audiences to truly grieve and also start to believe that Clark's death very well could be real. Weeks turned into months, and no new issues of Superman, Action Comics and so on were released. Those who at first doubted the legitimacy of Superman's demise were slowly starting to think that this might be the real end for the last son of Krypton. While they kept a brave face to the outside world, DC Comics were frantically trying to come up with a way to bring Superman back, and do so in a way that felt tasteful and respectful, but also shared the epic stature of his death at the hands of Doomsday. As Dan Jurgens, one of the main Superman writers at the time, recalls it,
"When we got done telling the story, The Funeral for a Friend, we stopped publishing the Superman books for a while. At that point, we had not yet decided, how does Superman come back? How do we bring him back from the dead? And one of the things we realized by virtue of that is the entire world was watching."
The company reassembled the same team of writers that had successfully killed him the year previous, and instructed them to figure out how to carry on the story, even after the hero was no more. Ultimately, a number of different ideas were pitched. Roger Stern proposed an ancient alien-like Superman inspired by Marvel's Silver Surfer. Carl Kessel suggested a new take on the classic Superboy character, described as an MTV generation Superman. Dan Jurgens was vocal about wanting to reintroduce the character of Hank Henshaw, a Reed Richards-esque scientist turned villain that he'd created a few years prior, while Louise Simonson and John Bogdanove devised a new character altogether, viewed as an African-American everyman, a blend of American folklore hero John Henry and Marvel's Iron Man. Unable to pick just one of these ideas, DC editorial ultimately decided they have 4 Superman comics that they need to continue publishing, and 4 different ideas for what to do next. So why not do all of them and dedicate each of the individual Superman titles to one of these new characters? And with that, the reign of the Supermen began. Adventures of Superman issue 500 was always viewed as a milestone issue by DC Comics, and the writers always seemed to have a big plan in mind for this event. Originally, this was going to be the issue where Superman and Lois Lane got married, but those plans were scrapped, and the issue then became penciled in as the initial resurrection point for the Man of Steel. However, after the success of Superman 75 and the ensuing Funeral for a Friend issues, DC weren't quite ready to bring Superman back just yet, and instead they wanted to tell a story that would build and let readers fully anticipate the hero's return. So instead, Adventures 500 kicked off the event that would bridge the gap between death and resurrection. But first, the comic contained a heartfelt response to the previous cliffhanger, with Jonathan Kent seemingly finding himself in the afterlife, where he comes face to face with his son. Clark and John share a moment, with the father reminding his fallen son of his unwavering will to fight, and the pair leave heaven together. Jonathan then wakes up in his hospital room in Smallville, only to be found by his wife Martha beside him. He tells her that he not only saw but spoke to and was with Clark, setting the stage for Superman to eventually return, as the comic ends with Lois Lane visiting the tomb of the Man of Steel, and only to find his coffin empty. Following Adventures of Superman 500, these 4 new Supermen took centre stage in their respective titles. Stern's ancient alien-like Superman became the last son of Krypton and took Action Comics. Jurgens' reimagining of Hank Henshaw as a cybernetic Superman was showcased in the main Superman series. Carl Kessel's MTV-esque Superboy took Adventures of Superman, while Simonson and Bogdanov's Steel aptly took the Man of Steel series. The reign of the Supermen, named after Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster's original 1933 short story, carried readers from June to October of 1993, as the 4 new Supermen attempted to carry on the legacy of the original hero. While Steel and Superboy were quickly outed as not being the real deal, questions still remained over both Cyborg Superman and the Last Son of Krypton, as both resembled the original hero and recalled many of the character's memories. However, it was ultimately revealed that not only were neither the authentic Superman, but that Cyborg Superman was in fact an existing Superman villain named Hank Henshaw, while the Last Son was outed as an ancient Kryptonian weapon known as the Eradicator, activated by the Fortress of Solitude, and had stolen Superman's corpse and placed it in a regeneration matrix, using it as a source of his power and believing himself to be the real Superman. Eventually, the Eradicator's exposing of Superman's body to the yellow sun slowly repowered the fallen hero, with Superman breaking free of his captivity, donning a sleek black Kryptonian battle armour, and returned to confront his imposters. Superman ultimately teams up with both Steel and Superboy to fight Cyborg Superman and Mongol in the ruins of Coast City, the former home of Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern, which had been previously decimated by the 2 villains. While Superboy stops a missile launched by Mongol from destroying Metropolis, Superman faces off against his cybernetic doppelganger, who attempts to kill his weakened foe using a lethal kryptonite gas, only to be stopped by none other than the Eradicator, sacrificing himself to save the real Last Son of Krypton, who swiftly defeats Henshaw and destroys his robotic body. Superman, once again alive and back in action, announces his return to a somewhat skeptical Lois Lane, who asks him what makes him any different from any of these imposter Supermen, to which Clark simply responds,
"How about To Kill a Mockingbird?"
his favourite movie, and only a fact that few people, including Lois, actually knew. And with that reveal, Superman had been resurrected and returned to the pages of comic books for good. The death and return of Superman had been completed. The actual story of the death and return of Superman may have ended there, with the Superman status quo returning in Action Comics issue 692, but I think it's important to take a step back and look at the legacy that this story has, and evaluate how it impacted the comic book genre and industry with both its rise and eventual fall. It would be hard to argue that the death of Superman story in itself was anything short of a tremendous success for DC, but the extent of its success set a dangerous precedent for the industry. As Reed Tucker notes,
"The success of The Death of Superman may have surprised many within the industry, but it reinforced the idea that events equaled sales."
DC's former editor Brian Augustyn shares these sentiments, recalling an editorial meeting where he was told,
"We killed Superman and sold 4 million copies. Marvel is doing this or that and they're selling 1 million copies. We're not sure what it is, but these epic events are selling out and driving the market."
In light of the death of Superman's success, shaking up the status quo quickly became the status quo. Within a year of Superman being killed by Doomsday, DC decided to shake up Batman, introducing the villainous Bane in the infamous Nightfall story, breaking the hero's back, and replacing him with the much maligned John Paul Valley, aka Azrael. Likewise, the destruction of Coast City at the hands of the cyborg Superman led to a villainous turn for Hal Jordan, as his grief manifested in the form of Parallax. These epic changes weren't exclusive to DC either. In response, Marvel rolled out several game changers in the form of the Spider-Man Clone Saga and Heroes Reborn. And it was ultimately this flooding of the market with earth-shattering, status quo-altering stories, coupled with their overall reliance on variant covers, special editions and collectibles, that caused the entire comic book market to crash in the late 1990s. Former DC writer Paul Kupperberg describes this best. He recalls how
there was a ridiculous amount of money being made, a ridiculous amount of product being sold, but also ridiculous expectations during that time. I thought, holy God, we're heading for a fall.
By the time that the reign of the Supermen was underway, comic book sales had begun to drastically decline, with distributors stuck with mass quantity of Superman and other comics stuck on their shelves when only the year prior they couldn't sell them quick enough. Marvel's then editor-in-chief Tom DeFalco noted,
"The news media realized they'd be scammed. Nobody covered it, but all the retailers ordered it like they still wished they'd ordered the death of Superman."
Likewise, this is put into perspective best by Brian Hibbs, a comic book retailer who told Reed Tucker that,
"I know a guy who made a throne out of unsold copies of Adventures of Superman number 500. A lot of people thought that it would sell as many copies as when he died. And of course, it didn't sell the tiniest fraction of that."
in the end, the death of Superman didn't actually kill the last son of Krypton, but instead, the series contributed to the sharp decline of the comic book boom period of the early 1990s. The comic's success represented the unprecedented heights that the industry experienced, but lightning rarely strikes twice, and in this instance, every act of diminishing returns only served to further damage the industry, leaving both Marvel and DC struggling, to this day, of regaining a fraction of the success they had in the days of the death of Superman. But with all of that said, I want to ask you one final question. What do you think the legacy of the death and return of Superman was? And how should we, as comic book fans, look back at this story and this moment? I think the death of Superman manages to represent both the highest and lowest points of the comic book industry. It's comics at their very best, and it's comics at their worst. While DC's attempts to capitalise on this iconic moment may have diminished the overall shine of the story as a whole, I find it fascinating to look back at how this entire scenario came to be. The collaboration of so many different writers and creative minds all pulling together to create one of the most groundbreaking and eye-catching stories at a time when DC Comics truly needed just that. Regardless of everything that came afterwards, you can't deny the sheer level of shock and awe that emerged when readers rushed to their local comic book store and gazed upon the climactic pages of Superman issue 75. If the intention of this entire story was, as the writers suggest, to remind the world of just how great Superman was, well, it's hard to argue they did anything less. In the end, the death of Superman was everything that it set out to be. A groundbreaking, monumental story that shook the DC universe to its core, with an impact that can still be seen and felt throughout the comic book landscape today. And whether that's for better or for worse is entirely up to you. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on the death and return of Superman storyline from DC Comics. Do you like it or dislike it? And how do you think it impacted the comic book industry as a whole? Let me know down below. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. I also want to give a big special thanks to all of the talented voice actors who helped me out on today's video. I can't thank them enough, their help was incredible. The links to all their socials will be down in the description, go and check them out because they're all amazing. If you're new to the channel, please consider hitting the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with all of the new videos we make, and there should be some other videos on screen right now that you may enjoy if you did indeed enjoy this one. That's all for me, but I will see you all next time, so until then, take care and keep reading.